And welcome back to another rereading of the first 60 articles on IndustryBroadcast.com. Before we get started into today's article, I just want to send out 3 reminders to everybody of where you can follow us and get up to date with the latest and greatest of audio articles. First being on Facebook at facebook.com/IndustryBroadcast, Twitter at twitter.com/IB podcast, and finally via the RSS feed on the website, or you can go to feedburner.google.com/IndustryBroadcast. But there are plenty of RSS adding buttons on the website for your convenience. So with that out of the way, we're going to get started on today's article, number 24 from Daniel Cook. And before you get all up in arms asking where are articles 22 and 23, well, they were just a little bit outdated and a little bit too short for my liking, so we're skipping on to number 24. A little bit of info about Daniel. He's the Chief Creative Officer over at Spry Fox, a grand old company focused on a new way of making and funding innovative games. He's been making games and software for over 15 years, and each day in his life seems to be getting more exciting than the last. His journey has led him through some of the largest companies such as Microsoft and Epic Games, as well as a variety of visionary startups. For more information and the rest of the articles written by Daniel, you can head over to his website at www.lostgarden.com. So get your game designer hats on, because today's article is all about that. My name is Ryan Wienko, and this is Industry Broadcast. Managing risk. Much of game production is all about managing risk. We partake in a highly complex process that juggles people, technology, new forms of interactivity, and rapidly changing market dynamics. Developing a single game is a high-stakes effort in which the likelihood of failure is dramatically greater than that of success. One false move and the development team can face financial ruin or heavy restructuring at the request of their publisher. It is a fascinating optimizational problem that drives many of the practices in modern game development. Here are some rough notes describing different forms of risk, as well as my initial thoughts on techniques for mitigating certain types of risk. We'll start with financial risk, the big daddy. All product development consists of the act of producing and delivering something of value to customers. In return, the customers give you money. If this process produces profit, then you can develop more products. If it produces a loss, you're heavily encouraged to stop making such products and do something more profitable with your limited resources. Economics abhors waste. The likelihood that you will lose money is financial risk. It is the invisible hand that makes all other forms of risk meaningful. However, simply looking at making money does not tell us enough to optimize our process. We also need to look at what we make and how we make it. Requirements risk. What the heck are we making? Requirements risk is all about making the right product for our customer. It is split into 3 interrelated categories. Naturally, any one of these risks can increase the project's overall financial risk. Those 3 being design risk, the risk of not including the right features that create a potent value proposition for your target audience. Scope risk, risks of not doing enough or doing too much. If you don't do enough, you increase your design risk. If you do too much, you increase execution and financial risks. Market risk. Risk that there will be changes in the marketplace that invalidate your value proposition. Market risk is external to your project. Of these 3, design risk is the most fundamental, with the other 2 acting as constraints. In order to mitigate requirement risk, you must choose the minimal right features for your product. This correct set of features changes over time as external events influence your target market. Execution risks. How do we make this? Once you understand what you need to do, you need to execute your plan. At this point, 4 additional risks raise their ugly little heads. The first being people risk. The risk that you don't have the right people with the right motivation and methods to work to execute your project. A subset of this is creative risk. in which you fail to create a product that you, as a creator, takes pride in. Often, creative risk can be in conflict with the constraints of financial risk. Technical risk. The risk that major technology that you rely on will fail. The obvious aspects of technical risk are things like rendering engines, pathfinding, etc. In games, technical risk often fluctuates wildly with the addition of new game mechanics. Since we are dealing with psychological and physical interactions with real customers, minor game mechanic changes can have surprising results. Even the act of adjusting a character's jumping distance may not work, since it can destroy the fun factor for the rest of the game. Schedule risk. The risk of delaying the product and missing a competitive window in the marketplace. Games are products with a shelf life and strong market cycles. When you miss your dates, you dramatically increase market risk for certain types of established genres. Finally, quality risk. Risk of errors. A product that solves all other factors but includes bugs and other malfunctions. Mitigating risk. A difficult problem to solve. You end up with a web of constraints with no easy solution. There is a wonderful section of Douglas Adams' book, Dirty, Gently Holistic Detective Agency, in which the lead character manages to get his sofa stuck in the stairway going up to his flat. He creates a 3D computer model of the situation to figure out how to get it unstuck, but can't manage it. Dirk Gently, the world's lateral thinking poster boy, solves the problem in seconds. All you have to do is remove one of the walls. Unfortunately, the solution to moving the couch would destroy the entire house. Whoops. Modern game development often finds itself in a very similar situation. Let's take the fundamental problem of choosing the right features for our product. An obvious engineering path is to add more features. Bridge builders might call this over-engineering, a time-tested technique. That way, you're always going to ensure that you make a product that solves everyone's needs, since it contains more than enough features. In game development, the secondary effects start to kick in. By increasing your scope, you increase the need for people, technology, time, and quality. Unfortunately, none of these scale linearly. When you add more people to a team, the communication process within a team changes dramatically. A 2-person team can sit in a room together and talk through problems. A 20-person team needs defined managers and a process. A 200-person team often spends the majority of each individual's time simply maintaining group cohesion and intergroup communications. Each stage is distinct and requires a major cultural shift to succeed. As features increase in number and diversity, the need for new technology development also increases. As game mechanics are added, the very nature of the system and its effect on the customer fluctuates radically. Each new feature has very real chances of destroying the value of the entire product. More features require more planning, time, and uncertainties can result in large schedule fluctuations. These are all compounded by technology and people risks. When you optimize for a single risk factor, you'll often have unpleasant secondary risks that bring down the whole system. The spectrum of process complexity. These high-risk, heavily interconnected systems are finally getting their due. Building games is not like engineering bridges. In fact, folks have started to notice that many traditional project management systems are counterproductive. When someone attempts to scale the project by turning one of the dials, the nonlinear risk increases in unpredictable ways and the product fails. The first step is to realize that there are different types of production processes, and each one requires radically different management techniques. Simple processes. When both requirements and execution are quite certain, then the project can be managed with relatively simple processes. Often, a simple checklist does the trick. The repetitive steps that a single worker performs on an assembly line is a good example of a simple task. Complicated processes. When the requirements and execution get out of hand slightly, you end up with a project that can still be completed with your typical checklist. However, you need to increase the number of rules and steps necessary to accomplish the task. Bridge building is a good example of a complicated task. Complex processes. Many projects fall into the dangerous middle ground where requirements and execution is somewhat different, but still rife with multiple layers of uncertainty. In these situations, high feedback agile processes let the team steer their way towards a goal despite high risk and high uncertainty. Software development is a good example of a complex task. Chaotic processes. When both requirement and execution uncertainty is very high, projects tend to devolve into unmanageable chaos. Success arises as often from luck as it does from any other real source. Game development is intriguing because it contains elements spread across all areas of the process complexity spectrum. Simple, for example, would be creating 2D art, complicated, creating 3D character models, complex, writing code, and chaotic, creating new game mechanics. If you end up focusing on a shoehorning of all elements of gameplay into a single process, you are bound to leave gaps in your competitive strategy. With that thought in mind, I'll be posting a couple more essays shortly that use this conceptual framework to examine two common risk mitigation strategies. Data-driven development, reducing risks by simplifying the process of game development. This technique focuses on reducing overall execution risk, and prototype-driven development, reducing risk by embracing change and finding the fun earlier. This technique focuses on reducing overall design risk. Managing Game Design Part 2, Data-Driven Development. The first technique, data-driven development, involves lowering execution risk by investing in lower risk products, features, and processes. This low execution risk strategy is the predominant technique used by game developers today, and is used to reduce risk and is considered state-of-the-art by most development houses. Compared to naive product development, there are considerable advantages. However, there are also unexpected side effects worth taking into account. If we think about data-driven development in terms of our process complexity spectrum, we want to drive processes out of the complex and chaotic zones down to the simple zone. Simpler development processes are easier to manage, easier to scale to large teams, and far less likely to fail catastrophically. Conceptually, data-driven development relies on two techniques: investing in existing low-risk activities and converting moderate-risk activities into low-risk activities. So let's start with the first one, investing in existing low-risk activities. The first step is to identify low execution risk items and invest in them. If we were to rank some common game elements according to risk, it would look something a little bit like this. New core game mechanics would be high risk. New to the world technologies, such as better AI, would be moderate high risk. New setting or IP or brands, moderate risk. Level design, moderate risk. More of the same technologies such as improved rendering, moderate to low risk, and finally graphics and cutscenes would be all in the low risk category. If you look at the resources spent on modern games, you'll find that game funding priorities are roughly the inverse of their execution risk. Core game mechanics have the fewest number of people working on it during the length of the project. Graphics of various types usually have the most. Level design tends to sit someplace in between, and so on and so forth. It's a rough rule of thumb, but it works reasonably well. Converting moderate risk activities into low risk activities. The next step is to simplify complex and complicated tasks in the hope of turning them into simpler production processes. Game development in the past was saddled with some truly unpleasant risks, such as crazy custom code written under tight deadlines for hardware platforms that were still in flux, or artists fumbling their way around new technology often introduced unacceptable schedule risk. And lastly, an example would be assembling the game elements at the end of the production cycle, which often meant that level design and minute-by-minute gameplay wasn't testable until very late in the development cycle. Now ask yourself, wouldn't it be nice to simplify these areas dramatically? Historically, the simplification of complex processes has occurred during the early stages of any new mass media lifecycle. Let's consider animation as an example of a typical evolution. Once upon a time, each artist drew in a very unique style. If you wanted a Norman Rockwell illustration, you pretty much had to go to Norman Rockwell. In the case of early animation, you typically required one animator to create most of the frames of the animation. Animations were short, labor-intensive affairs. Walt Disney and others came along with production techniques for the highly repetitive task of animation. They reduced the risk of producing a series of images with the same visual characteristics. Suddenly, instead of having one artist working in a particular style, you could have hundreds, all laboriously following a style sheet, all drawing Mickey Mouse. By defining specialized roles and standardizing the production process, early animation houses reduced risk and enabled the task to scale in a linear fashion. The same process of risk reduction is occurring in game development. Artists fumbling? This issue is solved by using standardized tools like Maya, Max, and Photoshop. When they are tightly integrated into a unified tool chain, they increase the speed of creating complex graphics while reducing schedule risk. Custom crazy code? Replaced by third-party rendering technologies like Unreal, Renderware, or CryEngine, which reduce the risk of rolling your own technologies. Assembling game elements at the end of a production cycle? I sat through a lovely talk on God of War in which 7 programmers created a highly tuned toolchain that allowed designers to act as highly reproducible, lower-skilled production cogs. The entire issue of game mechanics was reduced to push a button and play the animation sort of affair. You could also playtest levels early on and very often. Data-driven development. The result of these process simplification efforts is a production model known broadly as data-driven development. By focusing on low-risk development elements, tasks like creating graphics, models, and other static content becomes the primary cost center for the title. The following practices are common. The company invests in a centralized engine maintained by a relatively small number of programmers. Tool development takes on a hitherto unprecedented role. Game mechanics might be borrowed from an existing genre. Another would be that the team streamlines the flow of data into the game engine using a well-defined content pipeline. This allows people without a lot of programming skills or any at all to build much of the content using artist-friendly tools. The data is rapidly translated in the game engine where it can be viewed running the actual game. The team then ramps up the number of artists and designers to fill the game with all sorts of content. This all allows the focus of the title to be on providing the most exciting, highly polished, static content to wrap the core game mechanics. Data-driven development optimizes many but not all aspects of game development. Some gameplay elements, such as new game mechanics, have not yet been reduced to simple production processes. These remain stubbornly in the land of complex or even chaotic process. Companies try to reduce these risks as much as possible by selecting well-explored game mechanics. God of War is a great example of this development process. They gained impressive production efficiencies by building a strong content pipeline around the proven gameplay. The core gameplay differed only mildly from beat-em-ups from ages past. However, they made the experience feel fresh by skinning the mechanics with flashy content. Every time you pressed a button to open a door, you saw a new animation. Every time you killed a monster, you saw a new animation. It looks great, and it doesn't play all that bad either. The benefits of data-driven development. Data-driven development is clearly superior to naive game development processes of the past. It results in dramatic reductions in all forms of execution risk. Technical risk, for example, because most of the game rewards come from content instead of complex systems, the need for taking on technically risky work processes decreases. There is no need to put in a complex physics engine when the animator can produce the same results with less risk to the overall project. The overall code size is much smaller and you need fewer programmers. The God of War executable is only 1.5 megabytes in size and was produced by a team of mere 7. Quality risk. By creating tight content pipelines that is regularly exercised early in the development process, errors are found early and fixed early. Because you are dealing with data instead of code, code errors decrease dramatically. Schedule risk. Because game content is produced in a manner that scales linearly at low risk, you can easily throw more people at the problem or cut back scope if there is a threat of schedule risk. Finally, people risk. By having content readily playable and instituting style guides, Disney-style directional control can be imposed on areas like level design. This lets companies use relatively low-skilled designers as production cogs, and they are replaceable, easily trained, and scalable to a large workforce. This is an impressive feat. If you've ever lived through a poorly run game development process, the God of War presentation at GDC sounded like heaven. We all want to create a high-quality game that lets us spend the last day of development on the beach. If you don't understand the techniques and processes involved, your skills are behind the curve and your games will suffer. Opportunities for deploying data-driven development. There are two classes of game that benefit strongly from implementing a data-driven development process. Genre king brands competing in mature genres and story games that rely primarily on quality static content. The obvious win are products that are at the end of a genre lifecycle. Such teams are serving a well-defined market populated primarily by late and laggard adapters. Since the hardcore genre addict customers they serve are highly risk-averse, it's okay for the product to sport low-risk features. I mean, does anyone who buys Halo 2, 3, 4 really want a radical shift in game mechanics like you find in Animal Crossing? Not likely. There are also very specific genres of games that benefit greatly from data-driven development. Japanese RPGs or JRPG titles, graphic adventure games, and other games whose primary value comes from giving the player a strong linear narrative that can use a robust content pipeline to cut their execution risk. These story games compete head-to-head with the tales in other linear narrative formats, such as movies or books. The gap between the experience of a movie, like Advent Children, and a game, like Final Fantasy XII, diminishes with each new sequel. Such titles have forsaken interactivity as the primary method of providing players with value. The more high-quality static content, the better. Problems with data-driven development. Data-driven development is the future for a large portion of the industry. It is simply so much more efficient at managing risk than older methods. However, there are issues that a small, smart development team should take into account. Market issues. Low product differentiation. Cost issues. High production costs. And gameplay issues. High player burnout. Let's look at market issues first here. How do new games compete? That is the big question. I humbly submit that the unique value proposition in games typically are centered on innovation in interactivity, not on the static fluff wrapping that interactivity. For example, in Nintendogs, the value comes from interacting with a dog, not from the resolution of the wallpaper in the room. Even in God of War, the core value comes from the combat, not the pretty animations. The low-risk activities that data-driven development relies upon also happen to be low-value activities. You can easily add considerable graphics, level design, and animation to a product and only add incremental value to the customer. When companies compete using fluff elements such as graphics and level design, you may end up with a slew of undifferentiated products. In the early days of middleware, Epic started to license their Unreal Engine. Licensees replaced the graphics and the levels, but failed to innovate in terms of new game mechanics. The licensees believed that they were offering new and exciting content. The players, on the other hand, saw this flood of titles as inferior FPSs, with tired game mechanics. They ran smack into markets dominated by genre kings, Quake and Unreal. These titles failed. Oh, the irony. Differentiated content is not enough to compete. Cost issues. The other issue is that the strategy of risk reduction is not a cost reduction technique. By ensuring that production activities scale in a linear fashion at low risk, all that happens is that development teams are encouraged to do more of the same in order to compete. Most companies blindly invest in the most obvious and lowest risk competitive option, and this creates a vicious cycle. The competition releases a title with quote-unquote the best graphics ever. Your team chooses to compete by putting money into the lowest risk production element. By simply spending more money, they can keep their risks of execution failure low and still mount a competitive product. When another competitor comes out with even better graphics, then your producer sure doesn't mind hiring a baker's dozen of new art cogs to up the ante. It won't delay the product and could even give the game an edge. This is an easy management decision. The product releases and sells a very reasonable amount. Unfortunately, due to the extra production cost, it posts a loss. Even though your title is a financial failure, it provokes other competing companies to spend more money on quality in their titles. The cycle slowly drives profitability out of the marketplace. The results are low profitability games that launch in intensely competitive markets. The small percentage remains profitable by capturing the genre king crown, but more lose money. Gameplay issues. If we look at data-driven games from our action/reward gameplay model, then we can also predict some key characteristics of data-driven games. Data-driven games encourage player addiction by relying on two classic game design elements. Visceral rewards, that's where visceral rewards are ones that attempt to trick the brain into reacting as if it were put into the real world in a highly intense situation. You see a strong focus on emotional content and realism. Final Fantasy does this quite well by providing highly emotional drama in almost every cutscene. Unique rewards. Unique rewards are rewards that are different each time the player successfully completes an action. The classic quote from David Jaffe is his desire for lots and lots of special cases. I don't want any two doors to open the same way. Basically, you're still pressing the same button, but the results appear unique. Visceral rewards create very intense rewards. This can be very delightful to jaded players. Unique rewards, in the form of new animations, ensure that the rewards give the player a solid buzz each time they are executed. Visceral rewards have a high burnout rate, especially when they are reused. When you kill the Minotaur for the first time, it's quite exciting. After dealing with several of the beasties, the thrill of the kill wanes. Unique rewards might seem like a good idea, but they also too have a dark side. With repetition, the player will eventually grok the deeper patterns behind the quote-unquote unique rewards. Ultimately, they see the impressively tumbling statue in God of War as yet another animation that just opens a door. When the gameplay patterns become visible, players can prematurely burn on the title far sooner than the designer predicted. This can lead to situations like Quake 4. Here the franchise was damaged because the players focused on how the mechanics are more of the same. They dismissed the new expensive graphics engines and the plethora of content that was intended to differentiate the product in the marketplace. From a game designer perspective, data-driven games are a quick jolt of brain candy to be consumed and forgotten. They are low-touch, consumable entertainment products that fails to build deep and loyal customer relationships. When your ability to connect with your customer at a meaningful level is threatened, you have surprisingly high franchise churn. Crash Bandicoot, Sonic the Hedgehog, Lara Croft, these titles' relationship with the customers was much less secure than they imagined. Contrast this to Mario, a franchise that relies much more heavily on constantly updated game mechanics. By offering the player a series of unique, high-value gameplay experiences, Nintendo creates a strong customer bond with the character that primes the channel for future titles. Nintendo generally avoids player burnout and accidental damage to their highly valuable franchise by focusing on gameplay. not merely lobbing undifferentiated content at their customers. Closing thoughts on data-driven development. Data-driven development represents one vision of the current state of the art in game development. It eases a large number of issues that have plagued game development for many years. If you care at all about why you do the things you do, you need to understand the practice and repercussions of data-driven development. It is the current future of the console industry, and it is driving philosophies that will shape the work environment of most professional game developers. Many of us have been doing flavors of data-driven development for years, but expect extremely polished pipelines like the one found in God of War to become the default for upcoming generations. It is a potent technology if used correctly. Pure data-driven development is a solid strategy for titles in mature genres that have a brand capable of capturing the first or second place in such markets. Such genre king titles are the bread and butter of any publisher, and reducing execution risk is of paramount importance to them. However, companies should be careful of producing more than 2 or 3 titles that use the same game mechanics, or they risk devaluing the franchise. For all others, data-driven game development tends to be a very expensive way to fail in the marketplace. Execution risk may be low, but design risk and financial risk are actually higher than if you did naive game development. If you can't capture the genre crowd, exciting static content is rarely enough to carve out your own niche within the marketplace. You've invested a lot up front, and you won't get the sales on the back end. Even a title like God of War is a huge risk for Sony. They've supported it with a large marketing budget and a decent-sized development budget. It certainly has gotten them rave reviews, but sales have been disappointing for a AAA title. The first month in US sales were reported at only 200,000. By June, they had reached 500,000 worldwide, but the typical AAA title needs to sell anywhere between 900,000 to 1.2 million units, depending on how the books are kept. Now, admittedly, Sony was attempting to create a new next-generation IP. They were willing to take a moderate loss on the first title. I mean, it's a simple strategy. You create an expensive splash, get the brand in public consciousness, and then scoop up the pre-orders for the sequel. I have to wonder, though, if we've already gotten to the point where one of the world's top 5 publishers has to release a very expensive title as a loss leader in order to turn a future profit. Where does this leave smaller companies? Screwed and tattooed. At the very least, it suggests that launching original content-based IPs that rely on older game mechanics is an expensive and risky strategy. Data-driven game development is one risk reduction strategy. If everyone invests in this safe path, then there will be some remarkable future failures. This is just another tool, and it should be used with care and wisdom. And that wraps it up for audio article number 24, written by Daniel Cook. Another reminder that his blog is at www.lostgarden.com. And if you want to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or on the RSS feed, just head over to facebook.com/industrybroadcast, twitter.com/IB podcast, or just head over to industrybroadcast.com like all the other cool kids. Check out the RSS feeds and subscribe to it that way. Anyways, my name is Ryan Wienko, signing off from yet another audio article from industrybroadcast.com, bringing the collective insight of the gaming industry to your ears.